First and foremost, I just want to say thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. You guys seem like you have a pretty awesome club there, quite a few members and lots of activities. So you're very fortunate to have that. If you're not aware of that, let me let you know. We do have several pretty good clubs here in Central Texas, but there's a lot of places that don't. So it's a great resource. And whenever people ask me about how to get into fly fishing, I always tell them if there is a local club, definitely join. If you have to drive to get to a club that's within an hour or so, 2 hours, it's worth it. Definitely join because it really makes it a lot easier, especially if you're new or if you're just trying to find more people to fish with. So you guys are lucky. So tonight I want to just do a pretty quick sort of intro about myself and what I do and the bass fishing and how we fish here in Central Texas. A lot of the stuff will probably be applicable for you guys. A little bit of stuff about gear and all that, and hopefully we can spend the bulk of the time answering questions because I know what I know and I know what I like to talk about, but the reality of the situation whenever one of these things happens, it's much more fun for me and probably much more beneficial for you if you ask me questions. So questions about bass fishing, questions about fly fishing, questions about anything. I mean, you can ask me about my days as a musician. Anything you want to know, feel free to ask. So I'll just kind of run through my little presentation. And I don't have any photos or videos. There's tons of that stuff online. Any of that stuff you want to see, you can look me up. Like I said, I have a YouTube channel, Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff. If you Google Alvin and fly fishing, all my content will come up. So if you want to see that stuff, go for it. Tonight, unfortunately, you're just going to be looking at my face. So I hope that's not too offensive to anybody. But anyway, I, believe it or not, was born in the fly fishing mecca of Houston, Texas, and I got my first fly rod 47 years ago. I realized I had a birthday earlier this month, and I got a fly rod for my birthday 47 years ago. So I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but you can do the math if you'd like. And for years and years, the only fishing I was able to do was for bass and panfish and a little bit of saltwater. Houston is within an hour of the Texas coast. I was fortunate to have parents and grandparents and cousins and uncles that were all into hunting and fishing. So I got to get out quite a bit as a kid. When I got that first fly rod, I did not know anybody that fly fished. I'd never seen anybody fly fish. I read about it in a book at school and just told my parents that that's what I wanted for my birthday. Somehow or another, they found me a yellow fiberglass 7-weight Eagle Claw with a level line and a martin reel. I fished that thing for years and I cried when I broke it. Fortunately, I was able to get another rod, but I grew up fishing for bass. But I was always dreaming about when I was going to be able to fish and catch trout with my fly rod because, just like everybody else, a lot of people, me included, thought fly fishing was all about trout. And I moved to Austin in 1982, and shortly after that, I discovered the Austin Angler, the fly shop that you old timers may have remembered, the Visa commercial about they don't take American Express at the Austin Angler. Well, that was sort of my hangout for years and years. And I was actually in the shop one day, and the owner of the shop asked me if I needed a job. I don't know if it was because I was there so much that I must have been unemployed, or I guess finally after hanging out for so long, I had absorbed enough information to where he thought like, well, this guy knows everything. I might as well pay him to be here. So that was a really lucky break for me because that enabled me to really get into the fly fishing business. So I ended up being the manager of the shop, the buyer of the shop, and we started a guide service while I was working at the shop. And initially, it was just guiding for trout on our little tailwater fishery, the Guadalupe River. And, because still we thought, trout was what everybody wanted to catch on a fly rod. And that was great for years. Me and my buddies fished a lot, not just the trout fishing, but also bass fishing and fishing for redfish on the Texas coast. And fast forward to 2004, the Austin Angler shut down and I didn't have a job anymore. Well, at that point, I decided I would continue with my guiding. So I guided full time starting in '04. And because, I was a young guy, didn't have any responsibilities, I decided I'm going to be a trout guide, like a legitimate trout guide. So I spent 10 summers in Colorado guiding for trout, mostly on the Colorado River, the Roaring Fork River, and the Eagle River. And I was spending the rest of the year in Texas guiding for bass. Well, in 2011, I started a guide service, the guide service I currently run with my wife and my oldest daughter, called All Water Guides. And I was still going to Colorado guiding for trout and booking trips for guides in Texas while I was in Colorado. Well, if you've ever talked to any guides, especially in a lot of the western states, if you're a guide, you're probably giving, up to 50, 60% of your daily rate to the outfitter. And the outfitter does a lot for that money, so I never begrudged them, but I realized that I was creating a lot of business here in Texas that I was not able to do because I was in Colorado. So shortly after that, I decided I would become a full-time bass guide because I had realized after a couple of decades of just wanting to be a trout fisherman that really what I loved was the warm water fish because, I grew up in Houston, Texas, and it's kind of like that's what I was raised on. And I have like this nostalgic feeling for bass fishing. And I still get to go trout fishing occasionally. I spent a couple of weeks in Argentina this year and realized yes, I do actually still love to trout fish. But my first love is the bass fishing and then the redfish on the Texas coast and then trout, which is kind of funny for a lot of people. But the thing about bass fishing, and I tell people this all the time, it's a really great, even if you're thinking you want to trout fish most of the time, most of us have a lot more access to bass fishing than we do trout fishing. And the old saying here in Texas is if there's a body of water that doesn't dry up during the summer, more than likely it has bass in it. And, bass tend to be fairly aggressive. They tend to be a little bit easier to trick. The flies don't have to be quite as, accurate representations. And so it's a great way to, introduce people into the sport, because it's always good to go out and actually catch fish when you go fishing. So I think bass fishing is a really good way to kind of, get people into the sport. And like I said, there's a lot of access, there's bass everywhere. So I've kind of devoted myself to, spreading the word about bass fishing. And, we here in Central Texas, we've got quite a bit of water. Our main waterway is the Colorado River, the other Colorado River. That we have a Colorado River here in Texas that's only in Texas, and a bunch of small streams in the hill country. And so I fish mostly rivers. We do have some great bass fishing on the lakes all over Texas. And most people, when they think of fishing in Texas, they do think of bass fishing in the big, the big impoundments. And that is really, really popular. The nice thing about the bass fishing that we do here is that most of the rivers are not crowded. So Texas Parks and Wildlife Department actually considers our rivers in Texas an underutilized resource. So there's tons of people on every lake. There's great boat ramps. People have bass boats, but most of our rivers, it's hard to find a boat ramp. A lot of the rivers are smaller, so we have everything from, small brook trout streams that have bass, and we've got bigger rivers, the Colorado River, the Brazos River, rivers that we fish out of rafts, drift boats, jet boats, a lot of the same watercraft, a lot of the same techniques that you would use on some of the western streams for trout. So that being said, the bass gear that we use in Central Texas is a little bit more like what you would use for trout fishing. So my go-to bass rod is a 6-weight and with a floating line, because I prefer to catch them during the time of year when you can catch them on topwaters, poppers. So, everybody likes dry fly fishing. Texas, a popper is our dry fly. A heavy rod for the bass fishing that we do would be, a 7 or an 8-weight. We don't typically go up much higher than that because, like I said, we are river fishing. The river bass don't tend to be as large as the lake bass, so we don't have to throw as large rods. And the nice thing is that because there's not as much pressure, we tend to catch a lot more fish on the rivers than you would on a lake. Although the cool thing about when you show up on the lake, certain times a year, you can show up with a fly rod and a popper or a frog pattern and be fishing side by side with guys in, big bass boats throwing conventional tackle, and we'll actually outfish them. The bass, especially the Florida bass, which is pretty common most places now, they can be really, really picky if there's a lot of fishing pressure. So most of the big lakes, they don't see flies. They've seen every lure known to man, but most of them have not seen very many flies. So we can come in and do really well when there's situations where it's okay with a fly rod. If the fish are down really deep, it's tough, but if they're anywhere from the surface down to like 3, 4, 5 feet, you can actually do really well with the fly rod, and surprisingly well. I don't remember the exact story, but I know there was a recently, within the last year or so, a fly and conventional combo team that won a conventional bass tournament. So and a lot of it was because of the fly angler. The story's floating around out there. I'm sure you guys can find that one. But yeah, so I do on occasion this time of year during the winter when our waters are colder, we will fish with subsurface patterns. We will fish with sinking lines, sink tip lines, and I tell people all the time, bass fishing is awesome, not just because, number one, they're available, but also, there's a lot of skills that you can practice bass fishing. Say you're going to go on a steelhead trip and you need to throw a sinking line or sink tip line. A lot of people don't do that on a regular basis, and there's some great bass fishing that can be done with sinking and sink tip lines. So it's just a good way to kind of keep your skills up. If you have access, I saw earlier during the meeting, you guys have some local bass water, and I just think the more you can get out there and the more you can fish, the better you will be. And then when you get to go on a big fancy trip somewhere, it's not like you're starting from zero. So, if you haven't fished in 6 months and you go on a trip and then, it takes you 3 or 4 days just to get back up to speed, I always tell everybody just get out, fish as much as you can. If there's a pond, if there's a creek, like I said, if it doesn't dry up during the summertime, it's probably got bass in it. And you'll be surprised at how much fun you can have in just a little farm pond or a tiny little creek. So that is that's pretty much my spiel there. Hopefully you guys got some questions for me. Like I said, anything about bass fishing, any other type of fishing in Texas. If I see you guys have some great destination trips that you do. We've got some great fishing here in Texas, both bass fishing and saltwater fishing. Our red fishing, kind of off topic, but that is one of the coolest things that I've done anywhere with a fly rod, and it's it's a lot easier to get to Texas and do a freshwater inshore trip than say maybe getting to Mexico or Belize or the Bahamas. So that's something else you guys want to think about. And if you got any questions about that, definitely please ask me. So yeah, that's it for my official presentation. Hopefully you guys got some questions for me.
Yeah. I'll start, Alvin. Thank you very much. And I've seen photos of, float trips like just outside of the city of Austin. It looks super cool, and obviously makes me think next time I do maybe have to travel for work down that way, I need to maybe go a day early and try to go fish. You guys have more bass species than we do here. I think we mainly limited to largemouth, spots, and smallies. What's your favorite species to target? Because you guys have the Guadalupe bass and a few others that we don't have.
Yeah, the Guadalupe bass is probably my favorite just because of access. We've got some great smallmouth fishing in West Texas. So, I have to drive maybe 6 hours to catch a smallmouth, and I can, like 20 minutes from my front door, I can catch a Guadalupe bass. And the Guadalupe bass is unique to Texas, only found in Texas. It is a member of the spotted bass family. And so, you've probably seen some spotted bass. I'm pretty sure you guys have a spotted bass, but these guys are only found in Central Texas, and they are a stream bass. Like, they evolved in these small streams in the hill country. So like a big the world record Guadalupe bass, the state record, which is also the world record, was caught in the Colorado River, and it was 3 pounds and 7 ounces. So not a big bass. But the cool thing about that fish was caught on a fly rod by one of our clients on a guided trip. So they're a perfect fly rod fish. The Guadalupe bass, one interesting thing about them is the younger Guadalupe bass and the older, the largest Guadalupe bass primarily feed on insects. So when they're small, they eat bugs, and when they get, kind of to that maximum size, a little bit older, they tend to eat bugs. So once again, it's a perfect fly rod fish. They like the fast water, a lot like a smallmouth. And they were at one point, before the Parks and Wildlife Department realized that they would actually crossbreed with a smallmouth, they were sort of in danger of becoming extinct. One of the major drainages had nothing but hybrids. There were no pure Guadalupe bass. Another interesting thing about the Guadalupe bass is, since they've done a lot of research here in the last decade or so, they've started to realize that the Guadalupe bass are sort of like the western cutthroat. So the Guadalupe bass in the Colorado River are genetically different from the Guadalupe bass in the Guadalupe River, and those are different from the ones in the Llano River. So it's pretty cool the more we learn about this little fish, the state fish, which is kind of a small fish, which is kind of funny for the state of Texas because, everything here is bigger, but our state fish is actually a small fish, but it's a cool fish. So that's probably, we catch the largemouth, we catch the smallmouth, but we actually now are seeing people travel to Texas just to catch a Guadalupe bass.
Right on. Thank you.
Alvin, could you take a minute and talk about red fishing down in the Gulf?
Yes. You got anything in particular you would like to know about the redfish?
No, haven't done it, just read about it. Anything you can share?
Well, the thing I say about redfish is they're actually harder to catch than a bonefish. And I know people say, nah, no way. And I told a client that one day, and about a week later, I saw a post on the Orvis News blog, or maybe it might have even been Tom Rosenbauer's personal Instagram, and he said, redfish, definitely harder to catch than a bonefish. And like any fish, they can be stupid at times and eat anything. But the thing about the redfish, they don't have as good an eyesight as a bonefish. So it takes some really accurate casts at times. Like I said, sometimes you can land a fly 10 feet away and they'll charge over and eat it. But typically on an average day, you're having to make some really accurate casts to get them to eat. Like we say, the fly's got to, you got to paint a mustache on the redfish's nose with the fly in order to get them to eat it. Or other guys say, you can't wait for them to eat it. You got to feed it to them. So it can be a pretty challenging fish to catch, and it is your typical, flats fishing. Like if the water is more than a foot deep, we're calling that deep water. A lot of times we can catch them when it's shallow enough that the fish's back is sticking out of the water. And Texas is, I just looked, I think we've got like, just on the Gulf side, we've got almost 400 miles of shoreline and twice that on the inshore because we have this barrier island system. I believe the largest barrier island system on the planet. So we've got just hundreds, thousands of square miles of shallow water. And, redfish is the main quarry. Once again, you can, when conditions are good, catch them on a 6 weight, but 7 or 8 weight, the same type of tackle that you would use for bonefish would work, and a lot of the same flies, clouser minnows, crazy charlies, crab patterns, seducers, and certain conditions you can catch them on poppers. Like I said, people ask me all the time, what's your favorite fish? And it's kind of a toss-up. I could flip a coin. A good day of throwing poppers for bass, or a good day of chasing, sight casting the redfish in shallow water. I could take either one. and trout's probably third.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Good. My name's Elaine, and I happen to be one of the nuts that loves topwater bass fishing as well. I'm absolutely crazy about it. My question is, I cannot get to Texas. Do you know anything about bass fishing, say, in Wyoming?
Boy, that's a good one. Was that? Did you do are you doing the fly tying class on the poppers?
Yes.
Okay. I couldn't see you when you were talking earlier, but I recognized your voice and talking about poppers. I don't know about Wyoming. There's got to be some bass fishing there. I mean, there's definitely still water. Most of my trips to Wyoming, I was going there to catch trout because I'm in Texas, so I got tons of bass. But yeah, I really don't know. That would be I guess that'd be a Google question. But I'm sure there's probably some secret bass fanatics hidden in Wyoming for sure. Folks that are tired of catching trout because there's trout everywhere. But yeah, I don't know.
What are the problems at the high elevation? And so bass waters are not very warm in Wyoming, if they're the few I know of.
Yeah. So they're not going to be very big bass probably on average, short growing season and all.
Yeah, I presume your topwater is in the spring in Texas?
It depends. Spring, we'll catch them all summer, it kind of turns to like a, early morning, late afternoon kind of thing during the heat of the summer. And then the fall is, spring and fall are probably prime. Heat of the summer, okay. And occasionally we get a few warm days, and occasionally we'll catch one on top midwinter. One of our guides caught a couple on a deer hair diver just last week, so in February. So it can happen, but we've had some extremely warm weather lately, 80-degree days. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, so it can happen during the winter, but if I had to pick one time a year, I would say fall. Spring here, the weather's really volatile, both for the bass fishing and for the red fishing. It can be really good, but I tell people if you were going to travel to Texas to try to do either one of those types of fishing, I would say the fall, just because the weather typically is more stable. Now, we do have hurricanes in the fall on occasion, but typically spring is almost always windy, and you never know. One day it could be, we could have a high of 50, and the next day we could have a high of 90. So fall is a little bit more consistent, barring any hurricanes.
That's nice to know should I ever make it to Texas.
Yeah.
How big are your poppers?
Pretty good size. Boy, I should have some laying around here, but I would say, like a 2-inch total size, like a size 1 hook, pretty good size. I mean, I do have a popper that I tie, and I've got a video on tying it. I made a video on tying it for a while ago, and it has become super popular. I just call it the Dedeaux popper. It's just a foam popper with a with a rabbit strip tail. And you can make it in a bunch of different sizes, but the size that I make is probably about 2 inches total. There it is. Yeah, that fly is like one of the easiest to tie. And the thing I like about it is you don't have to make it really big, and it'll make a big pop. So it'll make a lot of noise, but still fairly easy to cast. Because that's one of the things, the noise factor is really great, but I don't like to throw a big giant popper if I can avoid it. If I can, as long as I've got about a size 1 hook, that seems to be big enough to hook, even the biggest river bass around here. So that's kind of my, 1 or 1/0, and that varies, from manufacturer, but about a 2-inch total from, the front of the fly all the way to the tail. So that would be my go-to.
Okay. That's about what we tie, sometimes a little smaller than that.
Yeah, smaller's good too. I mean, I tie that same fly down to like, an inch to throw on the 5-weight in some of the smaller creeks for the smaller bass and panfish. But that, just my
I'm very envious of what you have available to you.
Well, I am very grateful for what I have available to me. So it's great. We do have a year-round fishery here. Like I said, we do have one little trout tailwater that's mostly during the winter, and we got the bass fishing and the red fishing the rest of the time. So it's great. But we don't have that wonderful California weather you guys have, though. God, it gets hot here during the summer.
Lately, it's been rain.
Yeah, that's what I heard. That's what I heard earlier. Well, you can send some of it our way. We're parched already.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Alvin. I didn't realize that a lot of that fishing was on rivers, and probably our rivers are like that, or maybe 2 hours away. So they're local lakes, and the lake I'm thinking about gets pounded by, bass fishermen, kayak fishermen, right? So they're throwing crankbait, they're throwing everything.
Yeah.
So I'm coming behind them, spring, fall. What would you suggest to be throwing specifically?
I know one of the times when we do really well, I don't know if you guys have any frogs up there, but when the frogs are on the water, if the conventional guys are throwing whatever kind of frog they have, if you can throw a frog on the fly rod, I don't know if it's just because it's different enough, but I can go right behind the guys throwing frogs on conventional and catch fish. I mean, to the point to where, I'll go out and we'll start catching them behind these guys, and I'm like, okay, pretty soon somebody's going to troll over here and ask us what we're throwing, because it happens, So that tends to be one of the few times. And then another time of year here is during the cooler months. 2 other times a year. During the cooler months, when the bait is really small, that's another time when we do well, is when they're chasing tiny bait fish, because, it's really hard to throw something, an inch and a half long, on a bait casting rod. So, you might try something small. And then the other thing is if you have shad in those lakes, midsummer, the shad will, a lot of, at least here, and I think this happens a lot of places, the bass will chase the shad to the surface, because the shad are sort of stressed when the water temperatures come up, and they'll chase them in schools to the surface. And typically, I have better luck if I can get a fly. A lot of times the fish, when they're chasing shad to the surface, they'll hit anything. But if they get picky at all, the fly tends to work a little bit better than, crankbait or whatever else. When the conditions are right, and that is anytime the fish are not down deep, I feel pretty good going out with the fly rod versus guys with conventional tackle. And I think part of it's just kind of a confidence thing. It's happened enough times. I've been on a boat with another angler who fishes with both, and before it's over with, I've done well enough with the fly rod that that person has switched over to the fly rod as well. So I think you just kind of have to pick your times and maybe. Sometimes if the fish are down 20 feet, it's just going to be hard to get them with the fly rod. But I think if you're catching them anywhere from, 6 or 8 feet to the surface, I think you can do pretty well, Just got to have a little bit of confidence.
Well, what do you consider a good day of bass fishing?
Well,
You measure that in number of fish or in pounds of fish or like competitions or what? How do you out with friends drinking beer? I don't know.
It varies, and that's a funny thing about bass fishing versus trout fishing. Like if I'm trout fishing, somebody catches a fish, I can look at that fish and guess the length to within, a quarter to a half an inch. If I catch a bass, I have no idea how long that bass is, but I can look at the bass and tell you to within a quarter of a pound how much that bass weighs. So it really depends on the fishery, and so like on the lakes, because they do get a lot more pressure, and sometimes we'll do really well. If I go out on a lake, if everything is great, of course. Fishing conditions vary. Some days it's a great day because we didn't get skunked. But the rivers tend to produce a lot more fish, and just kind of depending on the river, some of our smaller, lesser pressured rivers, it's not uncommon to go out and catch 50 fish. And I would not say that. If somebody said, going to book a trip. How many fish am I going to catch on this trip? And I'll say, well, if we catch a handful of fish, it's a good trip. But, it's not uncommon on some of these smaller rivers to go out. Now, the biggest fish out of those 50 may only be 1.5 pounds, but we're throwing a 4-weight rod with a foam hopper on it, so it's like we're fishing for brookies. So same thing, you go to a lightly pressured brook trout stream, and it's nothing to catch 20 or 30 fish in a day. This is kind of how our streams are. The lakes, it's a little bit tougher, if you put half a dozen fish in the boat, but those half a dozen fish typically are going to be much larger than the ones you caught on the small stream. And our lakes our larger rivers are kind of halfway between, numbers wise versus size wise. So the Colorado River, which is our largest river in Central Texas, I would say if you caught 8 to 12 fish in a day, that's probably a pretty good day. And, several of those fish may be 3+ pound fish, which is a great bass for anywhere. And then, we've got some rivers, just kind of, it's I guess trying to pin a fishing guide down to a number is a hard thing to do. So that's about as good as I could give you. We definitely.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I see a hand there.
Is my on?
You're on.
Yeah, Alvin, I want to ask you about the sand bass.
Okay.
This is a good time to target those. Do you for those as well on the Colorado?
We do. The sand bass or white bass, as we call them here in Central Texas. Different parts of Texas, they call them different names, but sand bass, white bass, the smallest member of the striper family, if anybody's not aware. For us, typically it's sometime late winter to early spring, based on water temperatures. We're starting to see them in some of the rivers now. So the thing is they live most of the year in the lakes, and then they spawn in the rivers. And so it's a pretty cool time of year because, there's millions of them, and they all come out of these big lakes, and they end up in these sometimes really small streams. And when I was working at the fly shop, the Austin Angler, that was actually probably the number one time for new people to come into the shop looking for a fly rod because they were like, oh, I was out white bass fishing with my buddies. You know, we were throwing spinners, we were throwing live minnows, and then these two guys showed up with fly rods and they caught like 10 for every one that we caught. The fly rod is really effective for that type of fishing, I think partly because of the way the sink in and sink tip lines work, and also because of the size of the bait that they're eating, and the river is so much smaller. The flies are perfect to imitate them. But yeah, it varies. You know, like I said, we're getting some in the rivers now. I would say February is probably the best month, depending on where you are. They may show up as early as December or as late as, you know, mid-March even. But it's, you know, it's all based on water temperatures, weather, and all that. But that's a great fishery, and it's one of those things when you find them, it's like it's fish in a barrel. You know, you can sit there and, you know, catch 100 of them. In Texas, there used to not be a limit on them, so people would come and literally fill up pickup truck beds with these fish. And this was like not ancient history. I remember when there was no limit, you know, and I'm getting old, but I'm not officially old yet. And now the current limit is 25 per day. So it's they're pretty prolific fish, and they're great to fish for. Now we also fish for them in the lakes, and we have one guide that's sort of his specialty. He catches them year round because they're sort of like the stripers. Certain times a year in the lakes, they'll chase shad to the surface. So you can go out and once again, you're like middle of summer, chase the birds around and you'll catch a ton of white bass, sand bass. So I guess, you know, that they're true bass as opposed to our black bass, which are in the sunfish family. So I guess that's definitely part of the bass fishing thing is white bass or sand bass. Do you guys have them there in California?
Yeah, we had it with this one lake, but because of the drought, has kind of decimated that fishery. And anyway, the question is April too late to fish those?
It will be in most places. Maybe further north in Texas, it's for the run. The run is usually tailing out most places by April. Occasionally, we'll catch them into April, but I wouldn't put money on it. I'd say March, but maybe early April. It's possible. And the thing is, if you come in April, you would just want to fish one of the lakes. You know, fish maybe at the mouth of the river. They probably won't be up in the rivers at that point. But I have caught them in April, but it's definitely a rare thing.
What kind of patterns are you using on the white bass there?
Oh, clouser minnows. A small clouser, gray and white, chartreuse and white. Those are pretty hard to beat. And by small, I mean really small. That was one of the old timers who used to guide for the white bass sold clousers. We sold clousers at the fly shop. You know, we would just get like giant bags full of clousers for the white bass season. And the flies that this guide used, he did not use the flies that he sold because he said they had too much material on them. But he said the ones that he actually used to catch fish on were so sparse that he couldn't sell them. So just a small, very sparse clouser would be the go-to. There's a few others, you know, like there's a mylar minnow. Another old-timer white bass guide here in Central Texas came up with that one. I think Charlie, the Cypress mylar minnow, that's another super easy to tie one. But if I only had to use one fly, it'd be a gray and white clouser, sparsely tied.
Great. One more question.
Hey, Alvin, I wanted to ask you, are you primarily fishing out of a boat, or is it some of the streams small enough you could wade?
I primarily fish out of the boat because I got so many boats over here. I feel guilty sometimes because some of these boats don't get taken out enough. But there's definitely more water in Central Texas that's wadeable. So we've got, you know, 2 rivers that I say you really need a boat, and we've probably got a dozen others that you could use a boat, but probably better wade fishing. So a lot of these small Guadalupe bass streams are like I said, it's like going out fishing for brookies or cutthroat. They're small water, you know, 7.5 foot 4-weight rod and a hopper, that kind of stuff. And luckily in Texas, you know, wet wading, you know, I would say 10 months out of the year we're wet wading. So yeah, there's a lot of good wadable water. I like boats because I like to take all my stuff, and I got a bunch of boats, but the reality is you don't need a boat. Even for the red fishing on the Texas coast, there's a lot of fishing you can do without a boat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions for the people in Zoom land? All right. Well, Alvin, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you coming on and joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all very much.
Thank you. That's great. You, like I said, you guys are lucky. You got a great club there, and if any chance I make it out to that part of the country, I'm going to look you guys up, and hopefully y'all can point me in the right direction to go catch some fish.
We'd love to have you here.
All right.
All right. Thank you.